Whenever an apologist attempts to claim that the Old Testament contains prophecy predicting the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, it is inevitable that they will rest heavily on the 53rd chapter of the book of Isaiah. Christian apologist Bob Dutko, in his desire to promote prophecy fulfillment as proof that the Bible is true, is no exception. Isaiah 53 is a favorite among apologists because, read in isolation, it seems to almost be a summary of the gospel message. Some even have gone so far as to call it the fifth gospel. It speaks of a servant of Yahweh who is despised by humankind, who suffers for the sins of others, is put to death, and who is spared death by his selfless act by the deity and exalted to a place of divine prominence. Isaiah 53 features prominently in Dutko's own argument as proof that the Bible is true, and we've waited until this episode in our series examining his assertions to tackle this most daunting of so-called proofs. Dutko has claimed,
it was prophesied in Isaiah 53:1 that he would not be believed, and we of course see in the New Testament he was not believed by many. It's prophesied in 53:5 of Isaiah that the Messiah would be scourged, and we read, of course, that he was scourged before his crucifixion. Prophesied in Isaiah 53:7 that the Messiah would be silent to his accusers, and sure enough, we read in Mark 15:45 that he was silent before Pilate. Isaiah 53:9 says the Messiah would be buried with the rich, and sure enough, it was a rich man's grave that he was put in. So Jesus gets put anywhere else, and the fulfillment of the prophecy doesn't happen. We read in Isaiah 53:12 that the Messiah would be crucified with criminals. And in Mark 15:27 and 28, we read, and they crucified two robbers with him, one on his right and one on his left. So what? You think they were going, the people that were crucifying, you think the centurions and others were going, now let's make sure to put him with criminals so that we can fulfill the Hebrew Bible's prophecies about the coming Messiah? No, come on. It's also prophesied in Isaiah 53:12 that he is to intercede for the people, which we see him as the intercessor in Romans 8:34 as well as Hebrews 7:25.
much to no one's surprise, Isaiah 53 has nothing to do with the Messiah not being believed by people. The subject of Isaiah 53:1 are the people themselves. Many scholars believe the voice in the opening verse of Isaiah 53 is a collective voice of the foreign kings mentioned in Isaiah 52:15. It is the kings themselves, after coming to realize the significance of the figure of Isaiah 53, who are asking in verse 1 who will believe their message. They were once incredulous, and now they think others hearing their story will be too. The irony here is that the New Testament does itself quote from Isaiah 53:1 in both John 12:38 and Romans 10:16, yet in both instances it is not to claim that a prophecy was fulfilled, but the quotation is to point out that indeed the message, the gospel, has been believed. It just has not been believed by the Jewish people. And yet John 12:42 reads, "At the same time, many even among the leaders believed in him." And while the Jewish people did in fact largely reject Jesus as the Messiah, the Gentiles are recorded as being much more receptive to the evangelist's message. If the voice of Isaiah 53 is indeed the nations, the Hebrew word goy, meaning foreign nations or Gentiles, being used in verse 15 of chapter 52, then those who didn't believe the servant in 53 are the same as those who are said to have believed in Jesus in the New Testament, the Gentiles. And simply the fact that the New Testament texts were written by believers sort of negates the assertion by Dutko that Jesus was not believed as a fulfillment of Isaiah 53:1. As for the remaining details of this so-called prophecy, we will look at the figure of Isaiah 53 as a whole in this episode, sure to pay special attention to Dutko's claim that the figure is the Messiah, Jesus Christ, who specifically was silent before his accusers, was scourged before his crucifixion and crucified among criminals, and was buried among the rich. Anyone trying to examine Isaiah 53, particularly in an attempt to identify the chapter's unnamed servant, soon finds the mind-numbing complexity of the issue. There are thousands of books and articles written on Isaiah 53 and its so-called suffering servant. Then, of course, there are dozens upon dozens of commentaries on Isaiah as a whole, all with interpretive sections on Isaiah 53 and the identity of the servant. Some say the servant could be Job, others Moses, or Jeremiah, Cyrus, king of Persia, the prophet himself, or an as yet unidentified Messiah. But the author or authors of Isaiah makes no explicit mention of this servant's name except to call him Israel in earlier sections of the book. Thus, a focus on trying to definitively identify the servant of Isaiah 53 will certainly not be taken up in this episode. Instead, we will see if that identity can be fulfilled by Jesus by taking each verse of the chapter and seeing if it applies to his story as given in the Gospels of the New Testament. From the outset, we must acknowledge that the Gospels and the interpretation of Jesus' life and the significance of his death for his followers were composed long after Isaiah 53 was written. It certainly is not out of the bounds of possibility that those writing the Gospels, or developing the oral stories that circulated about Jesus before the Gospels were written, but whose stories ended up creating the foundation for the Gospel narratives, created a narrative about Jesus that retrofitted over the servant of Isaiah 53. It is impossible to know for certain if details in the Gospel stories are historical or not. But even if we assume these details are indeed true, even in a broad sense, we will soon find that a comparison of the Jesus story is in fact not entirely compatible with the servant as described in Isaiah 53. And if the stories are not compatible, how can the one be prophetic of the other? It is equally important to note, in addition, that nowhere in the text of Isaiah is the servant called the Messiah, let alone identified as divine. If he had been, the Christian apologetic interpretation of the passage would be off on a much firmer footing. Scholars agree that the servant detailed in Isaiah 53 is truly introduced in Isaiah 52:13. Here he is described as one who will act wisely and be raised and lifted up and highly exalted. So far, so good. This sounds like a general summary of Jesus as described in the New Testament, but because the description is rather vague, it could describe any number of people. It's not detailed enough for us to be certain it is about Jesus specifically. And the devil, as they say, is in the details. The description in Isaiah of the servant goes on to note that his appearance is of one so disfigured beyond that of any other human being, and his form marred beyond human likeness, that people will be appalled by him. He is further described as one who had no beauty or majesty with which to attract others. He is said to have been despised and rejected by everyone. There is nothing in the New Testament descriptions of Jesus to even suggest that people were horrified by any physical disfigurations. In fact, one gets quite the opposite impression reading the Gospels. Jesus is frequently said to have been followed by vast crowds. There is, of course, the famous scene in Luke 5:17-20 of the paralytic man who had to be lowered in through a hole in the roof of the house where Jesus was staying because his friends could find no other way into the house, as it was surrounded by a throng of Jesus' admirers. In Mark 3:9, Jesus even had to arrange for a boat to carry him across the Sea of Galilee so he could escape from a crowd which was about to crush him. And then there's Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem, in which thousands praised him and exulted in their admiration for him. These are hardly descriptions of people who, as described in the book of Isaiah, are repulsed by the servant. Of course, one could argue that Jesus was indeed eventually despised and rejected, but that had nothing to do with his appearance as is described of the servant in the book of Isaiah. Jesus' rejection, at least by the Jews, had ironically to do with his failure to fulfill their expectations of what they believed the Messiah would be. They knew the Hebrew Scriptures' description of the Messiah, and Jesus had not fulfilled it. Isaiah goes on to sketch the character of the servant as a man of suffering and familiar with pain. But is this really the impression one gets of Jesus from the Gospels? Of course, everyone fixates on the suffering of the crucifixion, but Isaiah doesn't describe someone who has a single, admittedly excruciating, encounter with pain. The description is of one who has suffered their entire life, of one whose pain has caused them the aforementioned disfigurement, his suffering the result of his condition. Jesus in the Gospel avoids all pain and suffering until he meets his necessary end as the Savior of humanity, which he accepts willingly. However, Isaiah does write that the servant took up the pain of others, that he bore their suffering. This sounds very much like what Christians believe about Jesus' suffering and death. Isaiah goes into eerie detail, stating the servant was pierced for the transgressions of those who rejected him, that he was crushed for their iniquities. The traditional Christian interpretation of this passage is as a description of Jesus' suffering and dying for the sins of humankind, that he was pierced by nails as he was affixed to a Roman cross. One problem with this interpretation, however, is that the original Hebrew preposition in the passage is one of causal relationship. In other words, the servant doesn't suffer for the transgressions or sins of others, but because of those sins. The servant, although innocent, suffers alongside others. He shares in that suffering, although he did nothing to deserve it. Nonetheless, Isaiah does go on to state that the punishment inflicted upon the servant ironically brought peace and healing to others. No matter how that's sliced, it does sound very much like the Christian gospel. But what is meant by peace and healing? If one simply looks at the world, they will quickly find that peace does not exist. Not everyone is healthy. And this is true of those who have rejected the idea of Jesus as a Savior, as well as those who have accepted him as such. If these statements are true from a Christian standpoint, then peace and healing cannot be referring to what we see in the world. They must be understood in a so-called spiritual sense. And then the assertion that Isaiah 53 was fulfilled by Jesus becomes a faith statement and cannot be objectively verified. As far as the servant being pierced and Jesus fulfilling this as having been pierced upon his crucifixion, Isaiah does not state how the servant was pierced. It may have been with a sword or a spear. There is nothing in the text to suggest that the piercing was to be done by Roman nails. But Isaiah also says the servant was crushed. When was Jesus crushed? Christians may argue that this is a metaphor for the crushing sins of humankind that Jesus took upon himself. But why can't crushed be read as literally as pierced in the verse? Why can't it mean that the servant was to be pierced, perhaps by a sword, and crushed, perhaps under chariot wheels? Or why can't both pierced and crushed be read metaphorically? Christians read the verse and want to apply it to Jesus. Therefore, they're the ones deciding which words get to be taken literally and which ones need to be taken metaphorically. In other words, they're reading the text with a preconceived conclusion already in mind, and so fit the text to what they already believe, rather than let the text speak for itself. Isaiah further describes the servant as one who, although oppressed and afflicted, did not open his mouth in protest. Isaiah vividly describes the servant as led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers, as silent. He did not open his mouth in protest. Most apologists believe this to be a perfect description of Jesus at trial before the Sanhedrin and before Pilate. As Mark tells the story, the high priest stood up before them and asked Jesus, "Are you not going to answer? What is this testimony that these men are bringing against you?" But Jesus remained silent and gave no answer. The chief priests accused him of many things. So again Pilate asked him, "Are you going to answer? See how many things they are accusing you of?" But Jesus still made no reply, and Pilate was amazed. But it seems apologists trying to fit the servant of Isaiah 53 over the story of Jesus in the New Testament have selective memories. as they conveniently forget the trial accounts as retold in the Gospel of John. Here, Jesus is anything but a silent lamb led to slaughter. When brought before the high priest, Jesus does more than answer questions posed to him. He is openly defiant, to the point that one of the Jewish officials slaps him for his insolent behavior. Before Pilate, Jesus gets into a long metaphysical discussion with the Roman governor. So which version of Jesus' trials are we to use when deciding if he fits the model of the servant of Isaiah 53? Is he the silent lamb led to slaughter as described in Mark? Or is he the cool, calm, talkative version of the Gospel of John? Dutko made special note to say that Isaiah 53:9 was a fulfilled prophecy concerning Jesus having been buried with the rich. But that isn't exactly what the opening of the verse states. Isaiah 53:9a in totality reads, "The servant was assigned a grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death." Now the tomb into which Jesus' body was laid was provided by a man named Joseph of Arimathea, according to the New Testament. Joseph had requested Jesus' body from Pilate, so the story goes, and was granted permission to take it away for burial. In the Gospel accounts, Joseph is admittedly described as rich, but certainly not wicked. Matthew refers to him as a rich man and disciple of Jesus. Luke refers to him as a member of the council, probably in reference to the Sanhedrin. He's described as a good and upright man who had not consented to the council's decision and action against Jesus. Mark refers to him as a prominent member of the council who was himself waiting for the kingdom of God. John states Joseph was a secret disciple of Jesus because he feared the Jewish leaders. In other words, Joseph was, by Christian standards, a very respectable and righteous man. Burial in his tomb would hardly be considered having been assigned a grave with the rich and wicked. Now perhaps the apologist may quibble and argue that others buried in surrounding tombs were wicked, so that Jesus could be referred to as having been buried among the wicked as well as the rich, and there really is no reason not to grant this possibility. So the servant of Isaiah being assigned a grave among the wicked and the rich can certainly find a parallel with Jesus as described in the Gospels. But that is only one possible match so far, and several clear mismatches. But there is even more to this verse that requires our attention. While the passage reads that the servant was buried, it actually is not completely clear that the servant is really killed, despite claims that various verses depict his demise. We have already discussed Isaiah 53:7, which states the servant is like a lamb that is led to the slaughter. But this simile does not of necessity suggest an actual death. Verses 8 and 9, which speak of being taken away, cut off from the land of the living, grave, and tomb, may suggest that he was killed, but biblical poetry often uses such language to describe near-death experience or severe illness. Even the expression poured out himself, emptied himself to death can be understood as biblical poetry and not as literal death. Death imagery is often used in the biblical text to represent grave danger. We read this, for example, in Jonah 2:6. "I went down to the land whose bars closed upon me forever, yet you brought up my life from the pit." But virtually no one suggests Jonah actually died while in the great fish and then was supernaturally resurrected when reading this verse. It's understood as poetic speech. So while Christians may read these passages in Isaiah 53 as referring to the literal death of Jesus, the text itself does not demand such a reading. These passages could just as easily be interpreted as referring to a horrific experience from which the servant recovered. The servant of Isaiah 53 is further described as one who had done no violence. It was also said that he was not deceitful. And while most Christians view Jesus as having been incapable of violence and deceit, that isn't quite the picture we get from the gospel narratives about his life. In the Gospels of Matthew and Mark, there is the tale of Jesus cursing a fig tree. As Mark relates the incident, "The next day as they were leaving Bethany, Jesus was hungry. Seeing in the distance a fig tree in leaf, he went to find out if it had any fruit. When he reached it, he found nothing but leaves, because it was not the season for figs. Then he said to the tree, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again." A few verses later, Jesus and the disciples returned to the tree, and the disciples noticed the fig tree withered from the roots. Peter remembered what had happened earlier and said to Jesus, "Rabbi, look, the fig tree you cursed has withered." While apologists want to admit it or not, the tree is a living thing, and cursing it to death is a violent act. Then we have the story of the Gerasene demoniac. In this story, as related in all three of the Synoptic Gospels, but missing in the Gospel of John, Jesus encounters a man possessed by demons. As told in Mark, in part, they went across the lake to the region of the Gerasenes. When Jesus got out of the boat, a man with an impure spirit came from the tombs to meet him. He shouted at the top of his voice, "What do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? In God's name, don't torture me." For Jesus had said to him, "Come out of this man, you impure spirit." A large herd of pigs was feeding on the nearby hillside. The demons begged Jesus, "Send us among the pigs, allow us to go into them." He gave them permission, and the impure spirits came out and went into the pigs. The herd, about 2,000 in number, rushed down the steep bank into the lake and were drowned. Interestingly, Matthew's version has 2 men possessed by demons, while Mark and Luke only have 1. Apologists have explained this discrepancy away by claiming that Mark and Luke never say that there was only 1 possessed man, so there could have been 2. Matthew was just giving more details. It's a lame excuse offered up in the manner of Monty Python's Why Michelangelo Didn't Paint the Last Supper.
There were only 12 disciples at the Last Supper.
Well, maybe some of their friends came by, you know.
Look, there were just 12 disciples and...
Nonetheless, while apologists might argue that by curing the man he was freed of a debilitating condition, which is a good thing, the result was that a herd of innocent animals were driven into a body of water and drowned, losing their lives directly as a result of Jesus' actions. It's not as if, given the worldview of Christianity, the demons couldn't have simply been banished from our world. Jesus deliberately sent them into innocent animals, resulting in their deaths. We also have the story of Jesus driving out the temple merchants. In all the Gospels, we hear tale of Jesus coming into an established marketplace, one approved by both the religious and governmental authorities, and with a weapon begins to beat people and violently destroy their property. And this is hardly the act of a man described as having never been violent. Then, of course, there's the famous statement regarding Jesus' mission in Matthew 10:34-36. "Do not suppose that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to turn a man against his father, a daughter against her mother, a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. A man's enemies will be the members of his own household." While perhaps not a direct act of violence, the admonition to set family members against one another is nonetheless an acknowledgement that what he is doing will result in violence, and he willfully continues to advance that mission knowing its consequences. So certainly Jesus cannot be described, as is the servant of Isaiah 53, as one who was not violent. In fact, most scholars believe it was his actions in the temple of overturning the merchants' tables that ultimately led to his crucifixion as a political malcontent. To suggest, at least in the context of the 1st century CE and Roman law, that Jesus was punished unfairly for nonviolent acts is to be willfully ignorant of the historical facts. As far as being deceitful, the Gospel of John reports that when Jesus appeared before the high priest and the elders of Israel, he declared that he was never secretive, but had always been open about his mission and its meaning. "I have spoken openly to the world. I always taught in a synagogue and in the temple, where all the Jews come together, and I spoke nothing in secret. Why do you question me?" And yet we read in the Synoptics that Jesus frequently demanded that his identity as the Messiah be kept secret by those demons he expelled, by his followers, and even those he healed. Jesus is also reported to have used parables whose meanings were deliberately hidden from those who heard them. The synoptics state that Jesus did not want everyone who heard him to understand his message and be saved. Mark and Matthew report Jesus as having said to his disciples, "The secret of the kingdom of God has been given to you, but to those on the outside everything is said in parables, so that they may be ever seeing, but never perceiving, and ever hearing, but never understanding. Otherwise they might turn and be forgiven." So, at least if we take seriously what Jesus said in John about always speaking openly in public and keeping nothing a secret, he was certainly misleading, if not outright lying, if we also take seriously the reports of his behavior and words in the synoptics. So as for the servant of Isaiah 53 described as non-violent and having no deceit, we can confidently conclude that this man does not match the figure of Jesus as described in the Gospels. Next, in Isaiah 53, we come across the description of the servant as one who God willingly caused to suffer and make his life an offering for sin. While this certainly sounds remarkably like the faith statement of Christianity regarding the reason for Jesus' suffering and death, it is not clear in Isaiah, again, that the servant actually dies as a result of his suffering. It is also not detailed that, even if the servant does die, that this offering is for other people's sins, much less the sins of all humanity. The suffering and offer of his life could just as easily be read as an offering for his own sins. More importantly, the verse goes on to state that the servant's life, in fact, will be prolonged, exactly contradicting the Christian story of Jesus' death. The servant, it appears, does not die. Not only that, but his days are lengthened by God so that he may live long enough to see his offspring. Now, if nothing hasn't been convincing yet that the servant of Isaiah 53 could not be equated with the figure of Jesus in the New Testament, this verse, speaking of his offspring, surely must seal the deal. But of course, apologists don't make their bread and butter admitting defeat, but by being creative and skillful manipulators of the biblical text. And you will easily find apologists trying to convince their gullible followers that offspring in Isaiah 53:10 is really supposed to mean, in a poetic sense, the Christian church itself. However, the Hebrew word used here is zerah, and it does not mean anything even remotely equivalent to a following of religious believers. It is used literally hundreds of times in the Hebrew Bible, and in nearly every instance is in reference to literal seeds, as those that produce plants, or of genetically related offspring or descendants by blood. If it is to mean religious followers, it means so only through the self-serving contortions of the Christian apologist. As Isaiah 53 draws to a close, we find in verse 11 mention that the servant will justify many and will bear their iniquities. Anyone with even a rudimentary familiarity with the Christian understanding of Jesus could immediately see a connection here with the servant of Isaiah. But again, that connection only exists if one reads the Christian apologetic interpretation of the verse instead of reading the verse itself. 11 states that the servant shall see the results of his suffering and be satisfied. This is rather an odd statement to make about the deified Christ, who in earlier chapters of the Gospels spells out his fate in no uncertain terms, clearly knowledgeable about what he is about to suffer and for what purpose. But the verse more importantly goes on to state that the justification that comes to others is not through the servant's suffering or sacrificial death, but specifically through the servant's knowledge. That isn't at all the Christian message. As Romans 5:9 clearly declares, Christians have now been justified by blood. The entire Christian message rests on this belief, and yet it finds no parallel in Isaiah 53:11, which unequivocally states that justification comes through the servant's knowledge. We need to single out here a portion of the final verse from Isaiah 53, since Dutko makes direct reference to it in his top 10 list of prophecies fulfilled, proving the truth of the Bible. For Dutko, the part of verse 12, which reads that the servant was numbered with the transgressors, is a prophecy fulfilled when Jesus was crucified alongside the two criminals, as narrated in the Gospels. Since crucifixion was a punishment meted out for unlawful behavior, it's unclear where else Jesus would have been crucified. Among the innocents? Besides, Isaiah says nothing about crucifixion, which is what Dutko says it does. Indeed, the transgressors of the verse in all likelihood reckons back to the nations mentioned in 52:15, and whose voices are speaking throughout Isaiah 53. In other words, in a Jewish context, the servant is Israel, and it, as a nation, has been caught up in the transgressions of the other nations of the world. It is because of their transgressions that Israel, the servant of Yahweh, suffers, and is therefore numbered among them. There is just as much evidence that this is the proper interpretation of the verse as is the Christian understanding. While this sounds like the Christian belief about the significance and purpose of Jesus' atoning death, if the servant is understood as the nation of Israel itself, as is the argument made by Jewish apologists, it makes just as much sense. When reading the verse, it depends upon which conclusion you're aiming toward. Besides, as has been the case throughout our examination, we need to read verse 12 in its totality and not cherry-pick through the portions that only the Christian apologist feeds to us. The verse actually begins by stating, "I will give him a portion among the great, and he will divide the spoils with the strong." Who are the great that God says he will be giving a portion to the servant? What could this possibly mean in a Christian context? And dividing spoils with Christ? Again, what could this possibly mean? In the context of Isaiah itself, this verse sounds far more like a description of the servant's reward for his suffering in the terminology of the spoils of war. It's certainly possible that this metaphor could be used in a Christian context, but it seems a rather odd, if not awkward, fit. But even if the verse does reflect the Christian understanding of Jesus' sacrificial death to bear the sins of many and make intercession on behalf of transgressors through that death, these are statements of religious faith and not of historical fact. How can the historian or the archaeologist establish objectively or uncover an artifact that provides evidence that Jesus bore the sins of many and that he made intercession on behalf of transgressors? Nonetheless, given everything else we've covered in our verse-by-verse examination of Isaiah 53, it's doubtful that, even if this final verse can be stretched over the Christian depiction of Jesus, it's too little too late. It is important to conclude our examination of Isaiah 53 as a prophecy regarding Jesus as depicted in the New Testament stories about him by pointing out that nowhere in the narrative texts of the Gospels themselves do any of Jesus' disciples, or anyone else for that matter, make the connection between Jesus and Isaiah 53. Indeed, when Peter identifies Jesus as the long-awaited Jewish Messiah in Matthew 16, he is vividly taken aback when he learns that Jesus is going to die. Had Peter equated Jesus, whom he had immediately prior recognized as the Messiah, as the suffering servant of Isaiah 53 as understood by Christian apologists, he shouldn't have been so shocked. Jesus is not portrayed in any of the Gospels as self-identifying with the servant of Isaiah 53 either. As Professor Morna Hooker has observed, I can find no convincing evidence to suggest that Isaiah 53 played any significant role in Jesus' own understanding of his ministry. That understanding would have to wait until later in Christian history. Indeed, the authors of the Gospels seem to make some isolated connections between events in Jesus' life and the portrayal of the servant as described in Isaiah 53, but there is not a recognition that the entire chapter prefigures Jesus. Like later apologists, the Gospel authors cherry-pick isolated verses from Isaiah 53 and interpret events in Jesus' life through the chapter. But if Isaiah 53 really was a prophecy concerning Jesus, Why didn't anyone in the gospel narratives during the lifetime of Jesus ever make that connection? Even the gospel authors don't agree on the events which are supposedly prefigured in Isaiah 53. For example, a portion of Isaiah 53:12, which reads, "He was numbered with the transgressors," which Dutko himself identifies as a prophecy concerning Jesus' crucifixion among criminals, is given different treatment by the author of Mark and the author of Luke. Mark 15:28, which most scholars believe is a later addition to the narrative, claims this verse was fulfilled by Jesus having been crucified with criminals. Luke 22:37, however, has the transgressors of this verse in Isaiah referring to Jesus' own disciples. The fact that the authors of the Gospels do not recount anyone in the lifetime of Jesus, nor of Jesus himself, making explicit connection between Jesus and the servant of Isaiah 53, of course, is not to negate the influence and importance of Isaiah 53 on the Christian interpretation of the vicarious suffering of Jesus. The parallels are clear, and the interpretation is understandable in a Christian context. But it isn't that context that interested us here. What we were here to examine are Dutko's claims that Isaiah 53 was a prophecy, specifically about Jesus. It is not merely a passage from the Hebrew Scriptures through which Jesus' life and death can be interpreted theologically. But as we've discovered, Dutko's apologetic gamble didn't pay off. Isaiah 53 is in no sense a prophecy directed about the person of Jesus as narrated in the New Testament Gospels. In our last and final episode dealing with Dutko's fourth proof for the truth of the Bible, we will look at what the authors of the Gospels likely meant and intended when they offered passages from the Hebrew Bible in support of their narratives concerning Jesus of Nazareth. And it's something Dutko and his modern apologetic ilk couldn't even imagine. Funding for this program was provided in part by the generous contributions of viewers like you via Patreon. Consider joining them at www.patreon.com/Bible Skeptic. Thank you.